So in terms of tapering, I want to state two things up front. First, we have to understand the principles. The principles are to decrease volume, to maintain intensity, and to maintain frequency. The second thing I want to state about that is, yes, it's a science, but it's not an exact science. We're extrapolating a lot of taper data. Some stuff has recently come out on resistance training, but most of the stuff that's been out for years on tapering is relegated to solely endurance training. So we're extrapolating a lot of this to lifting weights and powerlifting and stuff like this. So decreasing volume, maintaining intensity, and maintaining frequency. For example, let's say somebody's training in a volume block, and when I say volume block, keep in mind now, we're talking about integrated models of periodization. So if we look at periodization throughout the macro cycle, the course of a year, right, we have a linear change in volume and then intensity. But it's not linear like in linear periodization, the old school thought. We'd really have undulating periodization within each week that goes down in a linear fashion, right? That's volume, and then intensity that goes up in a linear fashion, but undulates, right, within each week. This point where they cross in the middle, before that is the preparatory phase. After that is the peaking phase. In the preparatory phase, we're running primarily volume blocks, right? So now what have we first done before we understand the principles of the taper? We've integrated an undulating periodization program design in terms of how the reps are manipulated within the week, but we've put it into a linear yearly macro cycle and into blocks. Now, we're in our preparatory phase early on in the linear cycle. So let's take that, and let's say in this early cycle in volume, we have an undulation pattern. We're squatting 3 times per week of 8 on Monday, 6 on Wednesday, and 4 on Friday. And our intensities are 70, 75, and 80. And we do that for 4 weeks, and we add, let's say, 2.5 kilos per week. How are we going to taper from that? Well, remember, tapering is decreasing volume, maintaining intensity, and maintaining frequency. So let's take intensity and frequency first, because those are easy. We have the 8-6-4 undulation pattern, squatting 3 times per week. Well, if we squatted 3 times per week during the block, we're also going to squat 3 times per week during the taper. Maybe on the taper, we have Monday as a taper day, Wednesday as a taper day, and then Friday as a test day, let's say. Now, on the 8-rep day, we were training at 70%, 6-rep day, training at 75%, and 4-rep day, 80%. So that's an average of 75% throughout that first week. So in our taper, we're probably going to average 75%. So what I would do for a taper, if we tested on Friday, is on Monday, I would train at 70%, and then on Wednesday, I would train at 80%. That gives us an average of 75, and then we would do our testing on Friday. For volume, we're making educated guesses. So depending on how much you do, you can make reductions of, let's say, around 50%. I actually like to go a little bit more than that if it's just 1 week there. But I might do something like 3 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 4 at around 70%, and then 2 or 3 sets of 1 at around 80%. Remember, that's 75% average, but that's a lot less volume than saying doing on Monday before. If we were doing 4 sets of 8 at 70%, now we're doing 3 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 4. On Wednesday previously, we were doing sets of 6 at 75%. Now we're just doing singles at 80, and that'll prepare you for your max on Friday. So the principles are there, and then we'll get into experienced versus novice. The principles are there very well. In that model, we've maintained frequency 3 times per week, and we put our test day in there. We have our average intensity still being the same at 75, with 1 taper day at 70, 1 taper day at 80. But our volume, let's take a look at this for a second. We've dropped it fairly dramatically, which is what the principles say. But on Wednesday, for example, I just said we're going to recommend doing 3 sets of 1 at 80% to prepare you for that max day. Tapering is a science, but it's not an exact science. Do I know that 3 sets of 1 at 80% is better than 2 sets of 1 at 82.5? I have no idea, right? I believe that those are both based upon the concepts. So if you do that, you should be in pretty good shape. But if anybody tells you, no way, 3 sets of 1 at 80% is terrible, you should be doing 2 sets of 1 at 85%. They don't know that. They're guessing. Those are both appropriate ways to do it. It's a science. You abide by the principles, but it's not an exact science. Now, getting back to experienced and novice, the one thing I would probably do here is keep intensity a little higher with experience than I would with novice, and I would be more aggressive on the volume drop with the novice individuals. Remember, if somebody's a novice, if they're doing nothing before and they just start doing something, they're going to make progress. So it's not like they're going to detrain in the taper week by really dropping volume by even something like 70%. Also, you have to keep in mind that the length of the taper is dependent upon the length of the block that is done. So if an experienced lifter does, let's say, a really, really high intensity block and it only lasts 3-4 weeks, then they might only have a 1 week taper. But if a novice lifter, let's say, because they can make progress for a long period of time, and you're going very gradually with low volume, maybe they have a 6 to 8 week mesocycle, I might actually run a taper for them for 2 or 3 weeks, right? And that might include actually 1 or 2 weeks of taper, and then really an intro cycle into the next block, because the novice individuals, they're making progress, and they can make progress on nothing. So I don't want to overstress them, even in the taper or in the introductory week. So an easy way to make sure to keep volume low as you progress with the novice is to maybe have an extra week of taper. So the differences between the experienced and novice, maybe have an extra week of taper for the novice if they've run a longer block, but I'd probably get more aggressive on the volume drop for a novice, and I might drop intensity a little bit for the novice, whereas with the experienced lifter, I would keep intensity high, especially if they were going into a competition, they were going to a competition coming off of an intensity block. But overall, the principles of a taper: drop volume, maintain intensity, maintain frequency. It's a science, but it's not quite an exact science. I hope that was beneficial.